Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. I am Nikhil Kumar. In the last video, we have explored how resource quota helps us control total resource usage per namespace. But what happens if your developers forget to define resource request or limits in the first place? That's where LimitRanges steps. Imagine we have a team where every engineer books any hotel they want for a business trip. But we need a rule like a maximum 5,000 per night. We have a limit to book any hotel. That's what LimitRanges do. They define default, minimum, and maximum resource usage per container or a pod in a namespace. So basically, how LimitRanges work. LimitRanges are namespace scoped. You can set default resource request or limits and minimum and maximum bounds. Kubernetes will apply these defaults automatically if a pod doesn't define them. This is perfectly complementary to resource quota, which enforces total namespace usage. Now that we have understand what is LimitRanges and how LimitRanges work, let's see it in the action. So this is our Kubernetes cluster. First, we will create a resource called LimitRange. For that, we will create our manifest file. Let me create a manifest file for the same. That is LimitRange.yml. So first of all, we need to specify the API version. That is v1. Then we need to specify the kind, that is LimitRange. Then we need to specify the metadata. Inside this, we are going to specify the name and the namespace. Name is default limits. Then we need to specify the namespace. So here I am going to specify dev namespace. Now here we need to specify the specification, spec, and we need to set the limits. So first we need to specify the default limits. So default will be CPU, which is 500 millicore, and then we have a memory that is 512 MI. Similar to this, we are going to specify the default request, and default request is CPU, which is 250 millicore, and memory, which is 256 MI, which is applicable to type, that is container. Basically, if a container in a dev namespace does not define any resources, Kubernetes will apply these default requests to that particular container. Let me apply this kubectl create -f LimitRange.yml. So LimitRange got created. Let's describe this. Kubectl describe LimitRange and the name of LimitRange, that is default -limits, and namespace, that is dev. As we can see, we have a limit, that is default limits, which is having a default request for the CPU, that is 250 millicore, and default limit is 500 millicore. Similar to this, we have a default request for the memory, that is 256 MI, and default limit is 512 MI, and it is applicable to containers. Now let's test this by creating a pod without specifying any resources. So let me create a manifest file for the same, vi pod-test.yml. So API version v1, kind is pod, and metadata, name is test pod, and namespace, which is our dev, and then we have a spec. So inside this, I'm just specifying the containers. So I'm going to create one container with nginx, and the image is nginx. Let's create a pod using this kubectl create -f pod-test.yml. The pod got created. Now let's check what Kubernetes applied automatically. So kubectl get pods -n dev, it's under dev namespace. Kubectl describe pod test -pod-n dev namespace. So container is running, and we can see it automatically applied the default request and the limits, which we applied by the LimitRanges. So limit ranges is very useful when any user is not specifying any request or the limit in the pod definition file. And if we run the same command to describe the limit range, we can see this is the same default request and the limit we have specified in the limit range. In my last video, we have covered the resource quota. Now it's time to combine both, that is resource quota and the limit ranges together. So in this, I've already created a limit ranges with the default limits and the request. Now let's create a resource quota. I will use the same manifest file which I used in my last video, that is resource quota.yml. So this is the same manifest file which I used. So I'm going to use the same to create a resource quota as well in the dame namespace. kubectl apply -f resource quota.yml. So resource quota got created. Let me verify that. It's under dame namespace. So now we have a resource quota and the limit ranges both. Now let's try to launch 11 pod in the dame namespace. So in this we have a limit, that is we can create up to 10 pod and one pod is already running in this. And we can request CPU up to 2 CPU and memory up to 2 GB. So for that, and we have a limit ranges as well. So let's try to create a pod using this. So limit range will request 250 millicore CPU and 256 MI memory by default. So here I'm going to use a for loop command. So this particular command will create a 11 pod with a different names. Let's run this. We can see the 7 pod got created, but the rest of the pod is getting failed. Why? Because we have a resource quota limit which we have hit by this particular command. If you see here in this particular command, we are getting an error while creating a pod, that is we are exceeding a quota, that is a team A quota. So basically resource quota is a namespace level budget. It will be applicable to the complete dev namespace, just like we saw in our demo. But limit ranges will be applicable to each pod or the container, and it applies default limit and the default request. Together they give you full control and safe boundary in multi-team cluster. That's it for today. Now we have seen how limit ranges helps us to set defaults and how they work in perfect harmony with resource quota. If you like this video, share it to your friends and subscribe for more content like this. I will add a link of resource quota video in the description as well. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.